Okay, welcome everybody. Just while we're waiting for everybody to settle and come in, you might put in the chat. It'd be lovely to know what institute you're from today, where you're dialing in from, or call or joining the session from today. So you're all very welcome. Is that everybody admitted now, Kevin? It is?
Yeah.
Okay, great. And the recording has started. Okay, so we might as well kick off. So you're all very welcome to our national webinar on the Commuter Student Experience Project. On behalf of NTutor, we are delighted to be hosting today from ATU, and many thanks to the Teaching and Learning Technology team for organising the setup today. Kevin Cunningham is on the call with us from ATU, and he'll be moderating and ensuring that everything goes smoothly. So thank you, Kevin, for that. My name is Dr. Karina Ginty, and I'm a Head of Teaching and Learning here in ATU. And during the NTutor National Programme of Work, I co-led the Student Empowerment National Work Stream with my colleague, Dr. Maura Maguire from Dundalk IT, and Maura is there waving. And Maura is going to be analysing the questions and moderating some of the feedback today during the session. So thank you, Maura. I'm also here today with colleague Dr. Sharon Flynn, and this is Sharon's final day on NTutor. We're very sad to see it all coming to an end, Sharon, and I know you're going to have a few words. So thank you so much for your role as a national coordinator, and it's been a wonderful few years working together. And wishing you all the best in your future post, and I'm sure we'll all collaborate again in the future. So many thanks to Sharon for all her support. So together as a team, we have the great pleasure of working with Professor Liz Thomas on the Commuter project, and we will hear more about that over the next hour. So a very warm welcome to Professor Liz Thomas, who's here with us on the call. And Liz, you might give a wave so everybody knows. I think hopefully they can see you all. And so Liz will be leading the session with the findings from today's webinar. So just a little bit about Liz. Liz has been working in the field of higher education, equity, widening access and promoting student success for over 25 years. And she joined the Department of Education in the University of York back in 2022. During COVID, and her background is eclectic, including social policy and evaluation. Her research covers many aspects of the higher education student experience and is predominantly qualitative or mixed method studies. So she's really committed to using research in a positive way to make a positive difference in higher education. And she certainly has led several programs in the UK and with other higher education institutes internationally as well. So last year, as part of NTutor, we had the pleasure of working with Liz in preparation for our national showcase, and she gave a really impressive keynote as part of the proceedings at Croke Park with all of our students and staff in attendance from across the sector. So Liz's keynote at the time had examined a whole sector and whole institutional approach to transformation management. And this was particularly relevant to NTutor and our Transforming Learning Work Programme, and led on to this wonderful study that we've been all involved with. And Sharon is going to give a bit of background on that. So I'm now going to hand you over to Dr. Sharon Flynn, who is coming in from TUA, our newly formed Technological University Association organisation. So I'll hand over to you, Sharon. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Karina. Yes, for anybody who doesn't know me, my name is Sharon Flynn, and I am currently the National Coordinator of NTutor. As Karina mentioned, today is my last day and this is my last official duty. It's lovely to see so many of you joining from around the country, so you are all very welcome today. For the uninitiated, in case there are any of you there, the NTutor programme was a very ambitious programme of work to transform teaching and learning in the newly emerging technological sector in Ireland. Essentially, the Irish government chose to invest 40 million under the National Resilience and Recovery Programme, funded by the European Union under the Next Generation EU scheme. And that took place between 2022 and finished up at the end of 2024. Student empowerment was a very strong focus of the programme of work, with a stream one of 3 work packages, which was led by Karina and Moira, as has already been mentioned. And that was very close to my heart, because I think that we really should be working with listening to our students an awful lot more than we do currently. Karina mentioned the big celebration that we had in April 2024, and I know that many of you were at that and many of you were involved in that. It was a fantastic event in Croke Park, and it was recognised really across all of the 7 institutions involved as a particular moment in the sector. It was described at the time as almost a coming of age within the sector. It was a fantastic day, a lot of positivity, and of course Liz was keynote at that event. And I know, because we had a meeting of the 7 presidents of the institutions, because they were all there, she particularly impressed the 7 presidents on that day, with her keynote speech and talking about the whole provider approach. So when a proposal came through to work with Liz on looking at the commuter student experience in Ireland, we just jumped at the chance. And so for a number of months, Liz was seconded to what was then Thea to work on this particular piece of work, which involved a number of coming together of commuter students to speak about their experiences and to look at what might help them into the future. So since that proposal came through, I have had the absolute pleasure to work with Liz and to observe her practices, including the town hall focus groups, and learning how she used student jurors to help to facilitate discussion and to bring together outcomes from those particular events. And on that, I would like to particularly thank all the students who took part wholeheartedly in those events, the students who took part as participants, sharing their experiences, sharing their challenges, but also, I think it's fair to say, in some cases, the advantages of being a commuter student. So those students, and also the students who took on the role as student juror, and who did a fantastic job, an amazing job of keeping conversations going and reporting back and being able to sift through a lot of the detail that was coming back. So I'm not going to speak too much more, but I am looking forward to hearing from Liz on her initial findings and recommendations from the piece of work. I think it's a hugely valuable piece of work. I think commuter students are something that we haven't really looked at properly within Ireland. And so if there is to be a whole sector approach to dealing with the challenges that are faced with commuter students, I think that could be a very, very good thing. So Liz, I will hand over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that introduction, both Karina and Sharon. And it's been an absolute pleasure for me to work with you and with other colleagues across the technological higher education sector in Ireland. I've got lots of material in these slides, and there's a huge amount of evidence from all the work that we've done over the last 12 months or so. And I will share the slides, of course, and there will be a report that comes out of it, but I'll update it following some of the conversations today, just to make sure that it's completely aligned with and relevant to all the things that we discuss. So, as usual, I'm quite ambitious in terms of what I want to cover, but I want to provide you a little bit of background context to the study. And then I want to talk about the review of the websites, which looked at the awareness and support for commuter students. And I've decided to abbreviate, and I hope this is not inappropriate, you to THEP, so to Technological Higher Education Providers. So you'll see that acronym THEP throughout the slide. So I'm referring to the 7 institutes and technological universities when in the technological sector when I talk about that. So I want to talk about what your current or baseline position is, as I perceive it, based on a review of the websites, and then to look at the experience of commuting, of actually traveling and being a commuter, the academic experience, and the wider student experience, and then to think about quick wins and longer term priorities. And then I thought I'd bring it back to this discussion about the whole provider approach, and hopefully out of that we'll start to think about what is a whole sector approach, as I think that it presents us with quite a unique opportunity. So I'll start by providing a bit of an overview of the project, and then sort of carry on from there. So the project really it has been explained to some extent, but it's a collaboration between NTutor, the 7 technological higher education providers, and what was Thea and now TUA. And me, and it involves this idea about looking at the current situation by doing a review of the websites, and then looking at the findings, particularly from the 2 online town hall focus groups. And there's already very interesting methodological issues that come out of this. We wanted to hold both in-person and online town hall focus groups, which you can understand as just big focus groups, really, where people work in small groups and then feedback to the big group. But we did very much found that for commuter students in particular, the online model of engagement worked much better. So I'm going to draw on the findings from those town hall focus groups, and we used our commuter student jurors to enable and facilitate those conversations, and to talk about their priorities for change. I'm not going to draw on that so much in this presentation. In our 2 online town hall focus groups, we had 39 participants from 4 higher education providers, and interestingly it was mostly students. There were 27 students and 6 members of staff, which doesn't, and 8 of the students were trained as facilitators. That doesn't quite add up, so I need to go back and check that, and I think maybe it's 9 members of staff. Anyway, I'll check that for you before I publish the report. A quick definition of commuter students, both in England and in Ireland. I think it's fair to say that commuter students are not a particularly well-defined group of students. We all broadly know what they are. So we've used very much a self-definitions, people identifying themselves as students. So broadly, we understand them to be students who continue living in the family home while they're studying in higher education, as opposed to relocating and becoming what we might think of as residential students in or around their place of study. Since the work I've done in the UK, this has kind of led to different discussions about definitions and what's an appropriate definition, and that came up to some extent in this study as well. So, for example, you might want to differentiate between local students and commuter students on some sort of notion of distance. The Union of Students in Ireland has also created a definition which is not particularly different either, but those students who live off campus and travel to their place of study. And then it sort of talks a little bit about the kinds of ways they might travel. But I don't think that's a particularly different definition to the broad definition which we started with in England, and I've used in this study as well. There's a little bit of research around commuter students in Ireland, and interestingly, around 40% of students remain at home and commute to college. And perhaps particularly important to this study is that the institutes of technology, or the technological institutions, seem to have more students who are commuters. And also students in Ireland have particularly long commutes. So the average student commute time evidently is 52 minutes one way. I think the evidence that we've got from this study, the qualitative evidence, suggests it's actually significantly longer than that for many of the students. And it also suggests in this research that the poorest students have the longest commutes. And some of the work we've done in England suggests that the longer the commute, the more negative the impact on students' outcomes, things like retention and completion and attainment. So I don't want to go through and spend an hour telling you about our findings, but we found things which will resonate very much with the findings that we see here in the Irish context. So we found that commuting is time-consuming, tiring, expensive and stressful, and often students hadn't anticipated that. Once students get to campus, they find that there's no real space or place for them. So they don't have anywhere to leave their belongings. They have no space where they feel like they can just be and where they belong. And they also complained, more than in the Irish study, about food. The food is inappropriate, it's inexpensive, it doesn't really meet their needs. But what we also found was that many of the commuter students identified themselves as good students who wanted to get a good degree. So they didn't see themselves as only sort of partially engaging or not there, you know, not really there in a serious way. They felt frustrated that often they felt their academic staff didn't perceive them as good students because they didn't see them around. There was a sort of perception that if you didn't see students around, then they weren't really engaged, and so there was a sort of negative connotation for commuter students. But they did make these quite strategic decisions. One student talked about using their time more wisely, that they would weigh up the value of travelling and the value of attending. And they also, perhaps not surprisingly, tended to prioritise their academic engagement over wider types of engagement in enhancement activities or social activities. So that's broadly what we found, and that was the sort of understanding that I brought to this study. And again, I don't want to spend too long on this, but the whole kind of idea about student engagement is very closely connected in the research with the ideas about student success. And there's lots of evidence that demonstrates that student engagement really contributes to and is correlated with students' continuation and completion. We also know that the whole concept of student engagement is really poorly defined. But I think what's important to think about, and we perhaps might want to return to, is the difference between attendance and engagement. So it's more than just being there. But I think we often, as staff, we sometimes see engagement and attendance as somehow related. And I think students feel that they could be engaged without being on campus all of the time. And in the English context, we haven't got a good, strong definition of commuter students, and we haven't got national evidence or national recording or monitoring of commuter students. So by piecing together evidence from institutions and national data and various other things, we start to see that commuter students appear to have less good outcomes than students who relocate. And so we know that commuter students have lower rates of continuation. And we also found a relationship between travel time and continuation in a piece of work that was done in London. We know that commuting students have lower levels of attainment, and that was done through various institutional studies and one piece of national data analysis. A national piece of work also found out that commuter students seem to be less likely to be employed in graduate jobs once they've graduated than those students who become residential. And also, Irish research has shown that living at home impacts negatively on student well-being, and so there seems to be a relationship between commuting and mental health and well-being. So if there wasn't enough reason anyway, I think all of this points to the value and importance of looking at the commuter student experience and how we might want to improve it. So what I want to do really is spend as much time as possible going through these findings and encouraging you to think about the findings and what you might do about it in your own context. So there are 10 questions that I've put onto a Padlet, and you can either use this QR code, or I think Karina is going to pop this code into the chat. And what I'd like you to be able to do is to get onto the Padlet and think about the questions, and I'll try and remember to indicate when I want you to look at the questions. So can you get into that and let me know if you can get into it?
I'm just going to share it, Liz, now. I'll share it again just in case people that have joined, they can't see it. Yeah. Okay. So either
hopefully,
through you can access through your phone with the QR code, or the Padlet board link is in the chat.
And we've tested it, so hopefully it works. But if not, if you want to shout out or put something in the chat, then someone will be able to let me know, because I'm struggling with my technology today. I can't see any of you.
But they can all see. They're all accessing the code.
Perfect. Great. I'll move on, and hopefully I'll get to see someone in the Padlet, which I've got on the other screen. Oh, I can see 4 people in there now, 5 people in there. Yeah, perfect. So one of the things we wanted to do originally was to create a sort of survey to understand the baseline in terms of what higher education providers are doing to support commuter students within their institutions. And we did run into some sort of quite extensive ethical challenges. So we didn't get ethical approval to do this. So instead of which, I did a review of the websites, and I only did it in June 2025, so quite recently. So it was a semi-structured review of the 7 higher education providers' websites. And it had 3 elements. I looked at keyword searches, so I looked at words to do with commuting, I looked at words to do with local students, and also this live at home phrase. I then looked at all the student-facing pages, so I looked at things like courses and academic experience and accommodation and travel and sports and clubs and student stories. I then dug into some of the other institutional documentation and looked at things like strategic plans, the equality, diversity and inclusion policy, and the learning and teaching or education strategy or policy, whatever it was called, for institutions. And in most cases, those documents were available. And so out of this, then I did a thematic analysis, and we've got 5 sort of themes that emerged that kind of give us what I think might be our starting point in institutions, which also then provides us with this backdrop for the student experience. So there seems to be very little or limited explicit recognition of commuter students on the majority of websites. And this is also seen in terms of there seems to be a lack of institutional commitment to commuter students, but rather there's a commitment to regions and areas where institutions are based. In terms of the academic experience, I think there's a lack of genuinely flexible, blended and inclusive learning. And in terms of the wider student experience, most of this seems to be orientated towards residential students. And so even in the best institutions, it's quite partial, and there seems to be some inconsistent positionality in terms of the way institutions view commuter students. And I think this is particularly significant given the quite large numbers of commuter students that go to many of the institutions. I'll unpack those themes a little bit further. So the first kind of theme was looking at the explicit recognition of commuter students. And it would be good to think about, you know, what kind of assumptions inform the contents of your student web pages. And I've asked you on the Padlet to think about what you might do to change your institutional website. But some people or some websites seem to assume that only staff commute. So when I put in the keyword of commuting, then it comes up with schemes for staff, and there seems to be a scheme around tax breaks for commuter staff. Or there's also assumptions that students are relocating to the area. So there's text around welcoming people to the area. There's also kind of assumptions around students needing accommodation. So there's lots of stuff about the biggest challenge you'll have is you know, sorting out your accommodation needs and that sort of thing. You might also have an assumption that parking is the only requirement that commuters have. So some websites have information about parking. Some websites, the better institutional websites, have some information about travel, so helping students to know what it will be like to travel to, or not what it will be like, providing information about travel and that sort of thing. And there's also a bit of an assumption that commuters only commute to save money, so none of this kind of recognition of the benefits. So you'll see that the second question I put on the Padlet is really saying, what are the advantages of commuting for different groups of students? So I would really encourage you to think about how commuters are positioned within your own websites. And when I started to look at the institutional commitment, there seems to be much more comment in things like the strategic documents around the commitment to the region and to students. And you can see from these kind of quotes, but this seems to be a mismatch between this kind of commitment to society and communities and putting people first. In this first quote, you can see students are put front and center. And the second quote, there's this idea about using technology to sort of support students. But that doesn't seem, there seems to be a mismatch between this kind of commitment to engaging people locally and actually the reality. So none of this is really followed through in terms of the informational support that's provided on the website as your kind of shop front, your shop window for students around what it would be like to be a commuter student, or how feasible it would be to be a commuter student. So in terms of academic experience, one of the first things when you see when you go onto almost all institutional websites, certainly these ones, I think, you see this kind of idea that you can search for a course. And there's the option to tick on flexible courses or blended courses or online courses and various other kind of terms that give you the sense that you'll be able to find something which might allow you to combine commuting with being a student. But actually, so you can do the course search, including modes of study. But when you start to look into it, there appear to be very few undergraduate courses that are available in an online blended or flexible delivery. And there's also a real lack of information about the delivery of courses. So it's really hard to tell whether you could live two hours away and do this course, or how many times a week you'd need to come onto campus. I think there's one exception here where they say they talk very much about their VLE and how the course content is delivered, and how you can do sort of mixed mode and hybrid courses, and how you can kind of access these materials remotely, and you can get engaged through things like quizzes and communication with peers and other instructors. But that's very much the exception. So that was one of the first things. It starts off looking like you can find out about these kind of more flexible ways of learning, but actually it feels quite hard to find that. And often there are only things like postgraduate courses or PhDs even. And then I looked at the teaching and learning policies, or the education policies, or whatever they're called. And the policies are available on most of the websites, but I couldn't find a single mention of commuter students in these documents. There's quite a strong commitment to things like inclusive learning and inclusive curriculum, and also the use of universal design for learning. And this talks about, in sort of, as this example says, you know, facilitates the adoption of inclusive teaching and learning methods designed to accommodate all learners. But it's not really clear how any of this translates into, or indeed whether it does, into a kind of learning and teaching environment that really enables commuter students to engage and sort of be full members of their academic experience and communities. And then I looked at the wider student experience, and as you probably know, there's lots of information about that. So I've grouped this into 3 areas. There's information about student accommodation and travel information. There's information about sort of students' lives. On about 2 websites, there are student stories. And then on all the sites, there's information about sports, clubs, and societies. So I would say overall there's an imbalance of information between student accommodation on the one side and travel information on the other. So the majority of websites really kind of assume that everybody is coming to live on campus for the first time. They're moving away from home, so it sort of conjures up ideas of a young student population moving away from home and sort of living on their own for the first time. So this comment is fairly typical. You know, students should remember that choosing a place to study, it'll be your home, and it's very important, and there's lots of stuff about how you might be anxious about that sort of thing. This is counterbalanced by one institution where they say our campus is predominantly a commuter campus, and they do provide travel information on their site, but you can also have help with your student accommodation, and that's a very different kind of tone and positioning of commuter students in this example. Although, as I say, that's not consistent all the way through the site. When I looked at student stories, there were no student stories explicitly about commuter students. Some were about local students, but often they were also sort of framed in the sort of the global positioning of the institution. So I just wanted to show you that a quick search in the UK suggested that as the profile or awareness of commuter students has increased, institutions are starting to put commuter student stories on their website. So these are some fairly random ones, but you might want to think about, what you might say positively around commuter students on your website. So in terms of question 2 on the Padlet. So various ones, and these are just students talking through their decisions. So you've got Rebecca from Chester, and you've got Bethany from Bucks New University, and then you've got this story from Birmingham City University, and it talks. Birmingham City is an institution that we were involved in quite closely, and they had no information about commuter students originally, and they were involved in the project, and then I went and did some more work with them, and they've now got lots and lots of hits on their website about commuter students, and a very different kind of idea about recognizing the realities of their students. And then there's another example here, which I can't remember where this one comes from now. ARU, Anglia-Ruskin University in Cambridge. And so they're just students talking about their experiences. So I'd encourage you to think about that as a kind of a quick win that you might want to do. And then finally, looking at sports clubs and societies. And there's lots of information, lots of commitment to the sports and groups and various things you might do on campus. But there's absolutely no mention of commuter students. And this is very much reflected in the stories that the commuter students tell us in the town hall focus groups. So as I say, that some of the higher education providers have much greater recognition of and commitment to commuter students than others. But these are quite incomplete. It's not carried through. This kind of recognizing commuter students isn't throughout the whole of the websites, and sometimes the positioning is inconsistent. So the strategic documents might not reflect things which are written elsewhere, or the information on the website might not reflect those kind of commitments that are made elsewhere. So I would conclude that the starting point, or the baseline, is a relatively weak acknowledgement and representation of commuter students. And there's not really any outright winners in terms of institutional websites, although some are better than others. So my recommendations are around the ideas that reviewing your website and thinking about how you engage commuters from the start, and not just about information about travel or assuming that students are new to the area, but really helping them to think about how they might be full members of the institution. But I wonder if that kind of dominant narrative needs challenging. So the students, the staff member, for example, identified there was quite a few positives around being a student. So it might be that it's cheaper, but it also might allow you to continue with your kind of care commitments or your work in the community, and it allows you to carry on playing in your local sports club. And I think at the moment there's quite a sort of negative kind of discourse amongst students, and I wonder how much of that comes from us as institutions and staff, and maybe we can identify and celebrate the more positive factors. So back to that kind of question about what is it that we might do to acknowledge and identify the advantages of commuter students on our websites and more generally. So that was the kind of the preliminary before I started writing the report. I thought we'd see where we were to begin with. And now I want to draw mostly on the findings from the town hall focus group. So the first question is about the commute itself. So you might want to think about question 3 on the Padlet, about what are the biggest travel issues at your institution. I think it probably varies between institutions, but I think mostly students were quite negative about their commuting. It takes a long time, they have to come onto campus very frequently, and there aren't many benefits. So this kind of quote here sums it up. It wastes 2 hours of being on the road every single day. And looking at what students told us about their commutes, the majority of students seem to be travelling 4 or 5 days a week, and a lot of them are travelling between 1.5 and 2 hours. And you can see that then this has all sorts of issues. Now, this quote I chose because the only positive thing is that there's a toilet on the bus and that they can charge their phone. That seems a really negative kind of a view of their kind of status or positionality as a commuter student. And the challenges are all that time they waste and often being late for the first class in the morning. And students talked about things like getting the earliest bus or having to have very limited number of hours of sleep because they get home late, then they wouldn't have time to study, and then they'd have to get up and get the bus again in the morning. You know, the positives: it saves money on rent, there's family support available, and this is sort of the other positives might be about seeing your family and saving money, but it's very tiring. There's such a lot of negativity in here, and this is the most positive comment I found in here was that no, not this one, sorry, it's another page. I think being a commuter student can be positive and negative. And I like this idea about the work-life balance, that you can actually leave college behind and kind of have a break. And that came out in some of the work we did in London, that students saw it as quite a positive thing. And it may be that we didn't frame the questions like that to look at the positives, but I think there's this kind of real negative sense of being a commuter student. And that's reflected on this slide, where you can see that students were able to identify lots and lots of challenges and disadvantages of commuting. Some of them are perhaps what you might anticipate. There's nothing amazingly unexpected in there. But there are so many stories about cancelled buses, late running buses and trains, issues with being late or missing classes. I think some of the other sort of negatives are this: it feels really relentless. So this kind of commuting 4 or 5 days makes students incredibly tired. They then say it's quite hard to find time to study in the evenings. You kind of don't necessarily feel like you can do it anymore. Things like there seems to be an issue that the bus times don't align with the lecture times, so then you have to wait around or you have to leave your lectures early, and sometimes there's no place to wait. And so there's a whole stack of these kind of really practical issues about being a commuter. And as someone said, staff often commute, so many staff can kind of relate to those issues. So that's the kind of experience of commuting. But these are the kind of interventions that the students were talking about. Overall, the best intervention for quite a few students would be that there's more student accommodation near to their higher education provider. So I think it comes through quite strongly that many of these students would prefer to be residential students, whereas in the English study, I think students were saying, actually, it's quite good to be a commuter student, and listing more kind of positive reasons. But some of the things they would like to happen are things like alignment of the teaching timetable with the bus timetable. So if the bus leaves on the hour and the lecture finishes on the hour, they have to leave the lecture early in order to get the bus. They'd also like things like buses from stations. So rather than all the students having to kind of get their own way from the station to the college or the university. As usual, issues around financial support for commuter students get raised. I think there might be some issues that you might be able to help me with around understanding what financial support students in the technological sector get, perhaps, or what commuter students get compared to other students. So there's issues around financial support and travel discounts, or kind of at least knowing about what discounts they're eligible for. Things like car sharing schemes might be more feasible to think about putting in place. There also talk about the fact that buses from certain destinations are really crowded, so there might be an argument for buses on popular commuter destinations that are run by a particular higher education provider. What we found in the UK research, and comes out in this as well, is that students will often have to arrive early in order to get a parking spot. So there's this idea about having a breakfast scheme, that this is a really nice way to kind of meet with other commuters and perhaps just to make a positive out of that sort of negative experience of having to get onto campus really early. And then there's a comment about food. There's less about food in this study, but there's an idea that maybe lunch vouchers would be helpful. So those are the kind of the practical side of commuting. So yeah, just get onto your Padlet. Wow. So I wondered there what kind of issues you had on yours, and I can see that you've got the same kind of issues coming up on there: public transport and parking and those sorts of issues. So then moving on to the academic experience, this is where the students are really the most unhappy, and you might want to think about question 4 around what you actually do in your institution to help make that academic experience more accessible. There's a real sense that there has not been any change or anything done to support commuter students. So you can see these kind of comments, you know, education's tailored to people who are close to the campus or live on campus. They forget that some of us live 2 hours away. There are unfair expectations put on commuter students. There's no empathy towards commuter students when things go wrong and they're out of their control. There's not a single adjustment that my college has made. And I would say it's affected me a lot because I have to deal with it. And, you know, they're saying, you know, lecturers have to be done face to face, and this is really not practical or accommodating of commuter students. And even staff are saying, you know, this doesn't appear to be making any accommodations for commuter students. So there are a huge number of kind of negatives that come out of this. And so things like attendance is a huge issue. So students talk about the fact that they arrive late or they miss the end of lectures because they have to go and catch the bus, and they end up skipping days. In the same way that English students were making these strategic decisions, Irish students are also doing the same thing. But then they have attendance policies which they feel are really unfair and don't necessarily take commuter students into account. Now, I understand that there'll be reasons why you have those attendance policies, but the timetable doesn't seem to take into account all of this context. And students are really struggling with the early starts and the late finishes that go on sort of day after day. And also those gaps in the teaching where they have sort of 3 or 4 hours to hang about. Some students are using that really positively to study in, but some students feel they can't do that as effectively. And both staff and students are reporting that students are tired, and this leads to a lack of concentration and focus. And some students talk about the idea that it's then hard to find sufficient time for their independent study. I'd also say that there appears to be quite limited use of the virtual learning environment. So things like lecture recordings, notes and online attendance are not really encouraged and don't seem to be part of the way that students are supported. And there really does seem to be this kind of lack of organisational change and support for commuter students. And the other part is around staff attitudes, and staff attitudes seem to vary quite a lot across the study. So some students were really kind of positive about staff. You know, my lecturers have always been very understanding, and if people need to leave early, that's fine. Some staff seem to be really lenient and to allow us to kind of leave early, or they're understanding if we arrive late. And some people seem to be caring, and some people don't seem to care at all about students who commute. So there is quite a mixed picture, but there are some really negative experiences. So I think I've left an institutional name in there. Sorry about that. So I think for the most part, lecturers are very good and they're accommodating, and some lecturers will put information online to help commuter students. But then there are some lecturers who won't help at all. So one lecturer puts up half the notes so that people who miss a class have to miss the notes as well. And another lecturer uses passwords for the lecture notes and gives out the password in the lecture. So only those people who've been can get them, or otherwise you have to then spend time trying to get hold of the password. So you can see that's really feels like it's almost penalizing deliberately students who struggle to get onto campus. And there are plenty of lecturers who don't understand, and they ask us not to show up as it will distract others, or they ask us to stay and so we miss the bus. And this student says, more negatively, we're seen as outcasts compared to students who live on campus or near campus. And so while lots of staff are from all institutions are seen as being really positive, there's also this idea that not all staff are positive. So what might we do about it? I think we need to think about the timetable. The timetable, or compassionate timetabling, is a massive issue. It's a massive issue in my own institution, and we need to at least think about how we might have no 9 o'clock starts, or how we might have a condensed or blocked timetable and reduce the number of days that students are on campus. We might also think about things like attendance, so removing attendance requirements for commuter students, or offering some sort of online attendance options. There seems to be some potential to make more use of the virtual learning environment to support both learning and engagement, so posting materials online and providing access to them, but also things like online discussion boards and things like that. There's some suggestion to use kind of flipped learning to make those in-person sessions more valuable. Some people talked a little bit about group study, independent group learning, and perhaps encouraging students to make more use of online platforms to facilitate commuter students to more actively get involved in group work. There are a few issues around assessments, things like more flexible deadlines, but also issues about start times for exams and individual assessments. So if you've got an individual assessment, commuters might have it at a time that fits with their own sort of ability to get on campus or the times they need to leave. And also sort of more options about handing coursework in, and perhaps the option to have online exams. There was also some issues around academic support. So one-to-one sessions where perhaps there was poor timekeeping, and so then someone's session was timetabled and it would fit in with their bus times, and then the sessions might run over, and then there's a kind of lack of understanding and accommodation of those needs. So perhaps a wider point about being able to be flexible in the delivery of one-to-one and academic support, and indeed wider student services, perhaps online or perhaps outside of normal hours. And out of this, there's this kind of sense that staff would benefit from more knowledge, awareness and understanding of the realities of commuter student experiences. So you might want to go on to question 5 on the Padlet and think about how staff might be supported to understand commuter students better. So across the focus groups, there's this general agreement that many staff would benefit from more appreciation of the realities of commuter student lives to help them make adjustments. So students talked about perhaps sharing the experiences of commuter students, or talking about a day in the life of a commuting student. But also things like helping staff to know how many commuter students they've got in their classes, and thinking about ways that they might talk to and find out about the commuter students in their classes, or perhaps their commutes and what it means. And so through having that more information, there's that opportunity to then perhaps be more accommodating. And also thinking about whether there are more ways to encourage this kind of remote engagement. So you can see that little quote at the bottom saying, having information workshops to let staff know what commuter students go through, identifying the number of commuter students within their classes, and finding ways to communicate with them while finding ways to accommodate them. So that seems to me something that the institutions could certainly take on board, some sort of staff development activity, perhaps even led by those commuter students. I noted that on the websites there wasn't much about the wider student experience, and that's very much reflected in the comments of students. So commuter students really talk about the fact that on the whole, they don't get involved in many of the social activities on campus because things happen in the evenings. There are fewer transport options in the evening. They have to wait around between the end of classes and the start of these activities. Only one student said socially it's very positive because I live close to my best friends and we commute together almost every day. So you might want to think about how we might create our student services to be more accessible and flexible to support commuter students, and how we might make the wider student experience more accessible? So that's questions 6 and 7 on the Padlet. I'm skipping through this as I'm very conscious I want you to have a chance to comment and ask questions at the end. So the wider student experience solutions, students were talking about covering costs and those sorts of things, but you might think about things like daytime activities or starting things in the late afternoon or early in the evening. Also, students identified the idea about using the gaps in their timetable. There might also be options around more online opportunities, or indeed organising activities in local areas, or even just acknowledging what commuter students do outside of their higher education experience. A couple of students suggested that the student union could have a kind of commuter student officer or could set up commuter student groups. And there might be more information available about what is available and how students could be supported more flexibly. And there's another suggestion about buses running out of hours to facilitate this wider student engagement. So I'm nearly there. In terms of quick wins, I think there are sort of a number of things which you might want to think about doing in terms of before the start of the next academic year. So on question 8, we've got some comments where some option for you to comment on what you might be able to do for next year. But I think you can make commuter students more visible on your website, welcome these students to the institution rather than just to the area, include travel information as well as accommodation, and include commuter students' stories about studying and ideally engaging in the wider student experience. And then perhaps explicitly welcome commuter students to your institution during induction and celebrate what they contribute to your institution. I think at the moment students feel quite marginalised and quite negatively positioned. And then create a point of contact for commuter students to provide information and support about things like travelling, studying and wider engagement. It might be simply about sharing tips and hints between students. You might also, in that sort of vein, encourage commuter students to get to know each other so that they can travel together, car share, meet on campus or meet in their local area. And you might facilitate that through things like breakfasts or lunches for commuter students. Although I have to say we found that online meeting was really popular with students. You might encourage commuter students to identify themselves to the institution so that they can be given information and also can provide information about commuter students. There's a kind of strongish theme around representation and voice. You might think about organising some staff training to raise awareness of commuter students' experiences and to encourage staff to find out about their commuter students and how they might better support and accommodate them. And that might be then encouraging staff to make use of things like the VLE and not to perhaps actively block students from engaging with academic materials. You might also think about how you encourage group learning, independent group learning to use online platforms and to engage virtually rather than always in person. I challenge you to work with your students' union to organise at least one daytime activity in your own academic or professional service area. To think about whether you could offer a limited number of one-to-one student support options via online platforms or at flexible times to kind of meet that need. And to think about developing a kind of commuter student forum where people can generate, where people can raise concerns and you could create an action plan. And finally, which is less of an action, but the idea about not confusing attendance with engagement. And I think that there's this really strong kind of discourse or notion that attendance is the most important priority in institutions. So, and then in terms of longer term priorities, I think there are things which are much more challenging to do around thinking about the role of commuter students in your institutional commitment to the social and economic needs of the region, and things like how that then gets reflected in the strategic plan, the equality and diversity and inclusion plan, and the teaching and learning work. And what is an inclusive learning experience for commuter students? What would that mean in reality? There might also be things around this kind of course portfolio, or at least helping students to understand which courses would be best suited to them if they want to study remotely some of the time. There's this massive issue of timetabling and attendance policy, and really being compassionate to commuter students. But there's a huge piece of work in there that perhaps needs to be confronted at some point. But there might also be things around the timing and of assessments and the granting of extensions and various other things that inadvertently disadvantage commuter students. It would be worth thinking about your travel solutions, such as buses or providing parking to car sharers and things like that. Thinking about space on campus, space where students can kind of store things or belong. And I think there's a whole agenda around acknowledging the strengths and skills of commuter students. So students did talk a little bit about being more organized, or because you have to be, and those kind of things that seem to get lost in some of this work. And thinking about co-curricular activities in popular locations. So Kingston University has been quite active at putting volunteering and study groups in areas where a lot of their commuter students come from. But I think a really important part is to really develop your institutional data and understanding about commuter students, so that you can talk about how many students are commuters and where your commuter students come from, and what's good about being a commuter student as well as what's challenging. I think I might pause it there, as we've got to 1:30. I've got a little bit more that relates this to this whole notion of a whole provider approach, but I'm very conscious that I've been talking for about 35-40 minutes. So I'm going to stop and open it up to questions. And then if you run out of things to say, I'll talk at you again.
Thank you very much, Liz. Just on the chat here, there's a question in from Suzanne Rorty. Was there any mention of part-time work or sporting commitments impacting their studies? I think a lot of our commuter students are commuters because of their outside commitments, and it is these that also impact on their attendance and studies.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I would agree, but that wasn't what students were talking about. They weren't really talking about those challenges. I'm sure they are juggling working and employment. It's certainly come up in the work I've been doing in York at the moment. But they were very much feeling that it was difficult for them to engage, given the number of times they have to travel and the lack of alternative ways of engaging.
And we thank you. And then we have a comment from Judith Fraser-Klug. I've developed an MS Forms class quiz as part of programme induction sessions that we're recommending lecturers to use. One of the questions for the class is whether they're commuting, living in student accommodation or in digs. Hopefully this will raise awareness across the class and amongst lecturers and lead to more open discussion about how to support commuter students, particularly if it emerges that large numbers are commuting.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we found that it's quite helpful for students to get to meet each other and think about how they might, study together or travel together and those sorts of things. And I think these are really important, although going back to the idea of the whole provider approach, which we haven't really talked about, there is a sense that if we only expect students to change, then we're still not really kind of shifting the nature of the institution. We're still expecting students to fit into our model of higher education.
And then we have Sharon who's left. We have a comment here just about, I know how placements such as hospital placements and community placements bring some added issues. I think it's...
Yeah, we've been talking to our professional education students at York because a lot of those are commuters as well. And I think they're really understanding that for their placements, they need to be commuting and it needs to be in person. But there are issues about how placements are organised and whether you assume everyone starts from campus or whether you take into account where people start from and those kind of issues.
And we have a question from Bernadette Donoghue. how would you recommend that we start gathering this data?
Well, I mean, what lots of the institutions that I've worked with have done is started by comparing home and term time postcode and using that as the definition of whether students are commuters or not. There are other ways of measuring it, but I think that's been quite useful, and that's given institutions in some cases quite a surprise to find out how many of their students would be classified as commuters. There are some issues with that, as people say, well, there are the very rich students whose parents bought them a flat to live near campus, and so they would come up as having the same postcode. But that's been the sort of first thing that people have been doing, and then you can flag them and look at sort of trends in the data. Some of the other studies have then tried to figure out travel time or travel distance and use that as another proxy. St Andrews, though, asked people to register as students, so they self-identify, and in that case it allowed them to be able to submit their assessments online rather than in person. So there are various things you could do, but I would suggest that you could do a moderately straightforward piece of analysis based on postcode, but you might also build it into enrolment forms so you could collect that kind of information.
And we have, so we've got a few more questions now coming in, some great questions. Una Barry's comment, I'm very interested in the provider approach. It's amazing how quickly we slip back into the sense that students are to be monitored or punished for not behaving within a predefined expectation. And then Monica McGraw has asked, have you any recommendation on types of activities to do during the day that you've seen have been successful?
I think it's a difficult one. Sometimes it relates to groups of students. So having a commuter student group or having something that relates to a discipline of study. So one institution, I can't remember which one now, is promoting their academic societies to have their activities during the day, and that allows you to align them more closely with when there are gaps in the timetable. But other institutions have been really negative and just said there's no space. All our space is used. Some of the students in this study mentioned that when rooms are empty, they'd like to be able to use them rather than be kind of kicked out because they haven't booked them and that sort of thing. So I guess your commuter students might be well placed to tell you what might work. And another institution, some of the commuter students were mature students, so they created a kind of, the mature student society had meetings during the daytime, which worked quite well for them.
Thanks very much, Liz. And we have another question, a practical question about how to gather term time postcode.
Well, I'm not sure. Our students have to provide their term time address when they register and enroll each year. So if you don't have that, that creates a slightly different question. But it feels to me that your enrolment form might be part of this sort of solution to this. But I'm very happy to stand corrected on that if you can't collect that information. I know different institutions in different national jurisdictions have different views on these things.
Yeah, it's a complicated one, and we've got a comment from Suzanne about the website and how the website, sometimes we don't realise how much they're geared to students who are new to the region, rather than students who are very much from the region. Are there any other questions that anyone would like to put to Liz? Oh, so here from Kerry Devlin, I've put lecture notes, tutorial notes, and recordings on Moodle. So that's VLE used by a lot of institutions across the sector, and still found the students have not reviewed them. Have you found a solution that could get students to review these?
No, I think is the short and simple answer. But I think the more it happens, then the more students expect it, and therefore the more they use them. So it's great that some people are doing it, but when that's the unusual, then I think students are perhaps less reliant on that. I mean, we encourage our students to go back and review the recordings and to use the slides for revision and that sort of thing. But I think these are challenges, but yeah, I haven't got a great answer to that. And I think we just have to be supporting students to make the most of them. But we find they're useful for our international students, for our disabled students, as well as our students with work commitments and students who commute.
And I think if anyone has if anyone has cracked it, I think we'd all love to hear from them. A really great question, though, Kerry. Do we have any more questions? I know there was quite a lot of activity in the Padlet as well.
Let's have a look. I guess I'm interested in how feasible these kind of changes feel, because it's okay for me to sit here and say this would be a good idea, but or are there other obvious things that we've missed?
We have another question in now. Have you seen any examples of platforms or campaigns to encourage students to carpool or lift shares? We have a lot of issues with parking. I think that would resonate now with a lot of us, the parking issues.
My previous institution had always, they have quite a lot of commuter students who drive because of the location of the institution. So they manage their car parks, so they have staff on the car park, and they the best spots are reserved for people who car share. So there's quite a built-in incentive. So they get to park really near campus, and then if you arrive a bit later or whatever, you end up miles away and you have to even get a little bit of extra transport back onto campus. So that's quite a good incentive for students to car share, but they still need to know who's coming from their area. So that's why I think you have to start with some of this idea about students identifying themselves and either self-forming groups or kind of giving them some of that information so that they can connect up with issues with other students, and I think you know, I mean, students quite like the idea of commuter student WhatsApp groups and things like that, where they can stay in touch and connect with other people. But institutions don't always want to be responsible for those kind of things. So I think maybe the way is to incentivize it in some way, whether it's kind of preferential parking or some other benefits that you can give them, and then sort of encouraging people by giving them information so they can connect up with each other, rather than perhaps enforcing people. I can think it could be quite problematic to enforce car sharing.
I think, and car sharing can be even tricky to manage with staff sometimes, can't it? Let alone with students. Does anyone have any other questions? There's quite a few good concrete suggestions now that have come in on the Padlet that everyone might be able to see.
Yeah.
If you've got some more questions, just pop them in the chat here.
Yeah.
And maybe something to note as well that I know we'll come to it at the end, Liz, but there is a report to be published on all of this, and even the feedback that you're getting today on the Padlet board will feed into that, which is really useful. And we're looking to launch that report formally with TUA, the newly formed Technological University Association, in the autumn. So we'll be working with Sean O'Reilly. I know Sean is on the call there somewhere. The mics are not enabled, but we'll be liaising with you, Sean, on that, and certainly Sharon as well. And so we're looking forward to that, and making, I suppose, putting a spotlight on it in September will be very timely, Liz, when everybody is getting ready and getting back to supporting the first year experience and planning for supporting all of our learners across our higher education institutes. So that'll be interesting, and hopefully we can call out some of those kind of quick wins, as you've mentioned, and some of the longer term goals, if they could be embedded in some way, would be very useful. I don't think anybody can speak or ask a question. Is that right, Kevin? All the mics are off.
Yeah, so, it's just the chat.
But the chat's still open, so if anyone else has any comments to come in. We can certainly take them. And I think that was absolutely fascinating. And it's really wonderful to have some very concrete actions to go away with, as well as the bigger picture things to think about. I think that certainly that's given me a good few very practical ideas that we could do something about really very quickly. So thank you very much, Liz. That was fascinating.
You're very welcome. I mean, I'm happy to kind of talk this through in terms of the institutional kind of whole provider approach, because I know that Karina and Sharon kind of mentioned that at the beginning, and I haven't really talked about it. But I can.
And just by magic, Sean has popped in a question. Would you like to say anything about the whole institution approach? So that's beautiful timing, great minds there.
Thanks, Sean O'Reilly. And then another colleague, Sean Fahy, has just noted 30% of AT students travel more than 30 kilometres. Okay, so that's from the National Transport Association results. Okay, that's interesting. And I think, do you want to say something about the whole institution approach, Liz?
Yeah, I mean, I won't put the slides up, but I'm really happy to talk about it. But I think what I would say is that there are kind of two broad ways that institutions have responded to this agenda. And one of those is really about what I've called changing students. So encouraging students to perhaps see the benefits of wider engagement and to create a sticky campus so that students will stay longer on campus. So there are various institutions who've gone down this kind of route of a sticky campus, or simply telling students more about the benefits and that sort of thing. And those are really important, and there's some of the quick wins that we might want to do, and they certainly validate students. But I think the other way is really about thinking about what we as institutions want to do. And that's really about kind of cultural and structural change. So these are the things that are really difficult, because they're about us changing a kind of model of higher education that we've had in place for you know, since the mid sort of 20th century. So we started to say, well, what is this whole provider approach? And I think broadly it involves a kind of an inclusive student experience, and we would say that takes place across the whole institution. It's not just in bits of the institution. It takes place across the whole student life cycle. So you're not just thinking about getting students in, you're thinking about, you know, second years and final years students as well. And it also takes into account the whole of the student's individual sort of experience and life, so the wider student experience as well. So first of all, you look at this kind of notion of an inclusive student experience. And in order to do that, you have to think about the institution and this thing that we've called the enabling environment that leads to the whole provider approach. So then from that, we've created sort of 4 elements or aspects of the enabling environment. And so the first thing, and this is reflected in some of the analysis and things that I talked about, but I haven't then sort of gone back to in this presentation. The first thing is about that kind of institutional commitment, and whether commuter students can see themselves and can feel comfortable in that institution. And then the second thing is really about the policies and the processes and the organizational arrangements, those broad structural things, that stuff that's really difficult that we've started to kind of uncover in relation to things like timetabling and attendance policy and you know, the VLE, and some institutions still don't record lectures and all that kind of structural stuff. And then there's a kind of big cultural bit about the attitudes and values of people. And you saw that some staff are super understanding and some staff are perhaps thinking that these are not very serious students, or that they are prioritizing other things over their attendance and engagement. And so there's this whole thing about how we actually develop staff's capacity and how we communicate with the student population as well, so that students are not part of the problem, they're actually enabling and supporting each other to be successful. So there's this kind of cultural side. And then the fourth element we looked at was around data and evidence, and in collecting that initial data and understanding the population, but also things like evaluating your interventions and changes. So what I think, using that framework, we can see from this study is that there isn't really a kind of a whole inclusive student experience, that, or at least the commuter students seem to be not having what they would think of as an inclusive student experience. And there seems to be a lack of an explicit commitment to commuter students. It's really sort of absent from the institutional narrative and in the majority of institutions, or it's only partially visible in one or two institutions. And then there are some really sort of extreme structural barriers to commuter student engagement and success. And these are the kind of issues that we mentioned around the academic and the attendance and that sort of thing. And while some staff are supportive and compassionate, the higher education providers are not really perhaps valuing, normalising and celebrating commuter students. So some universities are really trying to flip that into looking at what they bring rather than the challenges that being a commuter student involve. And so I think these students generally feel quite unsupported and sometimes quite invisible. And so how we kind of create a culture that values and sees them as part of the institution that's welcoming people to the region rather than, oh, well, we're not really talking about you just because you happen to live here. There's a whole kind of discourse around that sort of thing, I think. And there appears to be a kind of woeful lack of institutional data and understanding about commuter students, which really sort of reinforces this invisibility of students and impinges on making institutional changes. So I think what the whole provider approach, kind of the lens points to the more substantial changes that institutions would need to make. And without that kind of commitment and the structural and cultural change and the use of data and evidence, the student experience will arguably never be as inclusive as it could be. So I think for me, it's been quite useful to use that lens to move away from just the things which are about helping students to get more out of it and be seen a bit more, to making these more substantial changes in the institution.
Thanks very much, Liz. We've had a little more activity in the chat. So Margaret McClafferty has flagged the UL project, which is a large-scale longitudinal survey on student health and wellbeing across a number of institutions in Ireland, and that will include questions on commuting. So I think that'll be a really valuable resource for all of us. And then we've got a couple of specific questions. So Michelle Wood has asked, students have often mentioned their frustration to me regarding cancellation of classes and been notified during their commute. Did anyone mention that in the report?
They certainly did mention that. And I think that's all part of this like sense that they want to be understood and seen, and that being told at the last minute it's been cancelled makes them frustrated. I know they understand sometimes it can't be helped, but there's this general sense. And what's come up in York, where we've been doing similar work, is the idea that you know, you're not always checking your emails. Are there more effective ways of communicating this kind of information to students rather than, you know, you get there and then you see an email that says, oh, it was cancelled at 8 o'clock or something. So yeah, it did come up, and it's nice to hear that you're there, Michelle.
And we have a really interesting question here from Carol Gardner, following on from the Sticky Campus. So very interesting comments about a Sticky Campus. In your studies, how do commuter students describe their sense of belonging or marginalisation within campus life?
We didn't especially look at belonging in this, but I think that's something that I've been looking at through some survey data that we've used, and students do appear to have a much less strong sense of belonging. And I think it comes out in these qualitative comments about feeling quite invisible or alienated from their experience. Some of the other analysis I've done of the UK work, sort of, I think that commuter students are often, though, they'll also make comments about not coming to university for the friendship or the social experience. So there's this kind of, there are some students, commuter students, who think they're missing out on this kind of wild, exciting commuter student experience, which sometimes institutions sell to them. But the probably 2/3 would say, I didn't come for that. And so there's this sense that they actually want to be graduates rather than they want to be students. And so we have to think about whether that's just a necessity, or whether we might help them to understand how they might get more out of their student experience. And they talk very much about wanting to be in graduate jobs, and so we have to make that we have to think about some of that relationship between graduate skills and employability and graduate jobs. But then we need to think about whether the skills you develop as a commuter student are part of those graduate skills, rather than just assume it has to be leadership positions on campus in a student society, to be sort of slightly caricaturing. So I think they do have a lower sense of belonging. We didn't look at that explicitly here, but I think it opens up all sorts of issues about what students want and what they need and how we support them to be successful.
Thank you. That's actually a really interesting point about commuting. The skills acquired commuting has been key parts of graduate skills, but of course it's often they are the skills you use in working life, aren't they, in your employment. We have one more question here, and this is from Kerry Devlin. So it's a follow-up. Kerry's earlier question was about engaging students with material put on the VLE, and Kerry's suggesting giving the students weekly, bi-weekly quizzes, and either these quizzes are not captured in the grades, or they're captured as a very small part of the grades, but Kerry's also conscious of giving the students too many exams. So maybe they should be kept as not impacting their overall mark. What would your opinion be?
It's difficult, isn't it? I mean, I think we're all under pressure not to assess, but we're also mindful of things like AI and how that impacts on assessment. So at the moment, I keep hearing about assessing process rather than product. So maybe that's a way of assessing process. So maybe it's got something useful and could be thought about in that context as well. But equally, when we've done quizzes, which are really relevant to how they're going to be assessed, they've actually really found that a useful way to engage. But we've found them more, they sort of use them more when they've had sort of a seminar or a workshop session, that sometimes they can go a little bit unused if they're just up on the VLE. It's really frustrating, because we know these things would be good for students, but they then don't always engage as much as we want to. So there is an advantage to incentivizing them through assessments. But I think it might link with this wider discussion around AI and how we assess in a meaningful way in the new world. But I haven't got all the answers.
Well, I think that's all our questions now. That's been a really lovely and lively discussion. Quite a huge amount of ground covered there.
Yes. Thank you so much, Liz. I don't think we have any further questions, do we? And the Padlet board is available to everybody. We're finishing a few minutes ahead of schedule. So just on behalf of everybody involved with working with you, Liz Thomas, over the last year and a bit, thank you so much for your time. In particular, huge thanks to the students who were the stars of the show and who took time out to participate in the surveys and the town hall focus group sessions, which were really interesting, as Sharon has noted as well. So a really, really valuable study. We're looking forward to the published article. Another one to add to, I was just looking, Sharon, the reports you were publishing this morning from Commuter. Isn't it phenomenal, all of the outputs and videos and resources?
It really is. I think it gives a huge insight into the breadth of the activity that was taking place across the programme. So yes, please do go visit the website and have a look at all of the outputs that are there.
Absolutely. And we will set a date and a time. I think with Sean and with Tua, and maybe perhaps we'll involve the HEA as well, Liz and Moira and Sharon, on the publication of this valuable piece of work and this study. I think it will certainly help transform some of our practices at taking on that whole institutional approach, but certainly a sectoral approach as well is needed. So thank you so much. And thank you to colleagues for coming along, and to colleagues from across the sector. It is recorded, and it's one of the other outputs that we share from Commuter, from the suite of resources. And thank you so much, Sharon, your final day. Thank you so much for your collaborative work and all of the support, your leadership and everything that you helped helped us all through over the last couple of years. So we really appreciate that. And
No,
we're really saying farewell. We will. Our paths crossed so many times over the years, Sharon. So I know we'll be working again together.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, and Maura, did you want to say anything else before we finish up?
Well, just to echo those thanks. I think this is a lovely way to finish, Sharon, isn't it? To close this out. It's been a really fascinating session, Liz. Thank you so very much. There's so much here for us to work with and to take forward, and just it's been a real pleasure and privilege to have been part of this and to work with all of you. I'd like to thank let's say a huge thank you to Sharon and also to Karina. And of course to acknowledge the work of all the students and the staff who participate in the focus groups. But the students were marvellous. So thanks, and thank you everybody for coming.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah,
Okay.
I would just thank everybody for coming, and thanks to the three of you and other colleagues for facilitating all of this work, and the students were brilliant. I know that we wanted to have their voices come through, and I think there's so much richness from those sessions. So thank you all for making it possible.
Yes, thank you. So farewell, everybody. So have a good summer, those that are heading away on holidays.